What if I told you there were once places in America where white people were not banned from entering, but their power was no longer at the center? In a country that had long been used to deciding where black people could live, how much power they could hold, and how dependent they were supposed to remain, that alone was a warning to the old order. These communities proved something America did not want to admit. Black people could build their own towns, open their own schools, run their own banks, elect their own leaders, and take control of their own destiny. This is Hidden Black Chronicles, and together we bring buried stories back into the light. Today, we uncover 10 places in America where white people were treated as if they had no legal place. Number 1. Eatonville, Florida. In 1887, on a piece of land near Orlando, Florida, Eatonville appeared on the map and made the Old South look twice. A town built by black people, governed by black people, and run on its own terms. Now, 1887 may sound far away, but it was only 22 years after slavery officially ended in the United States. That was not enough time for a people to fully step out of the memory of being enslaved, separated from family, denied the right to read, denied the right to keep their own names, and denied the power to decide the future of their children. The chains were no longer wrapped around their wrists, but their shadow was still there in the voting booth, in the banks, in the schools, and on every piece of land black families tried to call home. That is what makes Eatonville more than just a small town in Florida. It stands as living proof that only 22 years after American law had treated black people as property, black communities were already building places that belonged to them. In Eatonville, they were not just working somebody else's land. They were buying land, building homes, opening schools, raising churches, holding town meetings, and choosing leaders from within their own community. What made Eatonville special was not that it was the loudest or the richest town in America. Its power came from something deeper, a community America had tried to hold back, standing up and building anyway. A black child could go to a school created by their own people. A black family could live on land they owned. A black town could decide the shape of its own life. Just a few decades earlier, those same people could have been bought, sold, separated, priced, and named as property. But in Eatonville, they rose up and built a life of their own. And what matters even more is that Eatonville created a kind of life many black people, after the Civil War, were barely allowed to imagine. In other places, they might have been called citizens on paper, but every step forward could be watched, questioned, blocked by law, money, or fear. Eatonville was not rich like the great business districts that would come later, but black people there could look around and see something real. Their community had a shape, a voice, leadership, and the right to decide its own future. Zora Neale Hurston is one of the clearest examples of why Eatonville became more than just a name on a map. Born in 1891, she grew up in Eatonville, surrounded by a black community that governed its own life. That shaped the way she saw people, and later, the way she wrote about black life. When Hurston entered literature, black people in her work were not shadows standing behind somebody else's history. They had a world of their own to belong to. And that is exactly what Eatonville proved just by existing. In a country used to seeing black people as cheap labor, hired hands and bodies controlled by law and money, this town showed the opposite. Black people standing on their own land, raising their children inside their own community, and living like people with the right to choose their future. So why is a place like Eatonville not talked about more often? Why does history so often begin with what was stolen from black people, but say so little about what they built with their own hands? Eatonville makes us sit with that question. This town is not the story of a people who only knew how to endure. It is the story of people who had just walked out of the shadow of slavery and still found the strength to open schools, build churches, form a government, and then believe that the future did not have to stay in somebody else's hands. If a black town could stand strong just 22 years after slavery, how many other names do you think did the same? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Number 2. Boley, Oklahoma. If Eatonville showed us what black self-government could look like in Florida, then Boley, Oklahoma, takes us into another kind of freedom: money, business, and economic power. In the early 20th century, Boley became one of the most prosperous black towns in America, with its own bank, hotel, schools, churches, newspapers, and black-owned businesses. At a time when black people could be turned away from white banks, humiliated in white hotels, and locked out of the best business opportunities, Boley stood as a clear answer. If America would not open the door, black people would build one of their own. Oklahoma once had more than 50 all-black towns, more than any other state in the country, and Boley was one of the brightest names on that map. When the Fort Smith and Western Railway came through the area in the early 20th century, Boley gained what every growing town needed: people moving in and out, goods passing through, mail, crops, and chances to do business. The railroad brought travelers in, carried cotton to market, sent news farther out, and slowly helped turn Boley from a small community into a respected black economic center. On those streets, people did not just see houses going up. They saw a town creating real opportunity for its own people. During its strongest years, Boley had a bank, hotels, schools, churches, local businesses, and its own newspapers, including the Boley Progress. Those things may sound ordinary today, but for black people back then, they carried real weight. A bank meant they could save money, borrow money, and build businesses without bowing their heads before doors that had already shut them out. Local newspapers meant their stories, their news, and their achievements could travel without being mocked, ignored, or twisted by people who never cared to understand them. In an America that often forced black people to work for somebody else's dream, Boley showed that they could build a place where every dollar earned, every child educated, and every printed page helped the whole community stand a little taller. That is why Boley has been called the Black Wall Street they don't talk about. Even Booker T. Washington once took notice of Boley as a model of black self-reliance. To him, and to many people of that time, Boley was more than just a small town in Oklahoma. It was proof that when black people had land, organization, and the chance to keep wealth in their own hands, they could build a community strong enough to stand on its own. So why is Boley not talked about as much as it deserves? Maybe because history often remembers the places that were destroyed more easily than the places that quietly built themselves up. But sometimes the building is the part we should be proud of. In a country that tried again and again to keep black people dependent, Boley left behind an image that is hard to erase. A town where black people were not standing outside the economy, but stepping right into the center of a future they created for themselves. Boley did not make white people illegal, but it did make white economic power unnecessary in the daily life of that black community. Number 3. Hobson City, Alabama. In late 19th century Alabama, the black vote scared some white people more than a gun ever could. Because once black people had the power to vote, they could help decide who sat in office, who controlled the roads, who shaped the schools, and what kind of future their children would inherit. For people who had only recently come out of slavery, the ballot was one of the few things that made their voice feel like it carried real weight. But across much of the South, that right was quickly squeezed down through threats, new laws, political boundaries, and all kinds of exclusion dressed up to look legal. In 1899, in Calhoun County, Hobson City was incorporated and became the first self-governing black town in Alabama. But the story behind it did not begin with some peaceful dream. It began with the pain of being pushed away from the table of power. Near Oxford, the black community had once played a role in local politics. But when white power moved to take control of that space again, black people understood something clearly. If they stayed in a town where somebody else always held the rules, their voice could be taken from them. So they chose another path. They built a town of their own, and Hobson City was born from that wound. What made Hobson City so powerful was that it had its own local government. People could gather, talk about their own community, and make decisions without always waiting for an outside council to speak for them. for people who had once been treated as if they were not fit to take part in public life. A town meeting room created by a black community meant something deep. Picture a black family living in Alabama in 1899. Outside that town, the South was tightening its grip on black voting rights in every way it could. But inside Hobson City, that family could vote for a mayor, talk about town business, and take part in decisions that touched their schools, their roads, their safety, and their children's future. To them, that was freedom. Hobson City makes us look again at a part of history that was hidden, softened, or left out. In this place, white people were not automatically the ones deciding the future of a black community. And if Hobson City could do that in Alabama in 1899, how many other black communities had to build a new place of their own just to keep their voices from being buried? Number 4, Allensworth, California. How many people were born in chains and still found the strength to put a free black town on the map for the next generation? That question brings us to Allensworth, California, one of the boldest black dreams ever built in the American West. In 1908, Colonel Allen Allensworth and a group of black founders created this town with one clear purpose: to build a place where black people could own land, run businesses, govern themselves, educate their children, and live inside a community they built with their own hands. What makes Allensworth so powerful starts with the man behind it. Allen Allensworth was born enslaved in Kentucky. He came from a world where black people could be denied the right to read, watched at every step, and treated as somebody else's property. And yet, he went on to become a soldier, a minister, an educator, and one of the highest-ranking black officers in the U.S. Army at the time. A man once placed at the bottom of society by that system later helped build a town where black children could grow up seeing themselves in a completely different light. Allensworth was planned as a real community, with schools, churches, businesses, a hotel, and local government. Those things may sound ordinary today, but for black people in the early 20th century, they were like bricks being laid down one by one, proving they did not have to squeeze themselves into cities that had already made room for disrespect. They could build another kind of city, one where black children could learn inside a community that believed in their future, and where adults could speak on business, education, land, and public life with their own voice. White people were not banned from entering Allensworth, but this town was born from a deep desire to stop living under the permission of white power. Here, black people wanted to decide what their children would learn, how their community would grow, where their money would go, and who would speak for them. That is what made Allensworth feel like a true freedom city in the minds of many black people at the time. But later, that dream did not grow the way its founders had hoped. Water problems, changes with the railroad, economic struggles, and the death of Colonel Allensworth in 1914 all weakened the town. Still, what happened there mattered. Allensworth became one of those places that helped black people see what could be possible when they claimed land, built together, and dared to imagine a future that belonged to them. Number 5, Nicodemus, Kansas. Are you really free if, after the chains come off, you still have to leave your home just to find a place where your children can grow up without the past pressing down on them? That is the pain behind Nicodemus, Kansas. In 1877, only 12 years after slavery officially ended in the United States, black families from Kentucky began moving toward the Kansas plains. They did not carry much wealth with them. What weighed heaviest was the memory of the South: debt, threats, land held in somebody else's hands, and the feeling that freedom on paper could still be crushed in everyday life. Nicodemus was born in that movement, tied to the exodusters, black families who left the South after Reconstruction to search for a new place to live. To them, Kansas was not some sweet promised land. It was a gamble. The plains were wide, the wind was rough, the first homes were poor, and the harvest was never guaranteed. Some families traveled hundreds of miles only to arrive on land that felt almost empty, where they had to build their own homes, figure out how to farm, and hold the community together through cold, hunger, and exhaustion. But that is exactly what makes Nicodemus so powerful. This town was not built on ready-made wealth. It was built by people whose history had been pushed to the edge, and they still found a way to put down roots. Every home in Nicodemus reminds us that Black people did not leave the South only to run away. They left to build a place they could finally call home. A place with a school for their children, a church for the community, land for families to hold on to, and graves where their ancestors would not be lost from memory. Today, Nicodemus is a National Historic Site, but behind that title is more than a few old buildings on the Kansas plains. It is the trace of Black families who left Kentucky with very little in their hands and still tried to turn hard land into home. And if a Black community had to cross an unfamiliar country just to turn freedom into houses, schools, and memory, have we ever really been taught the true cost of that word, freedom? Number 6. Weeksville, Brooklyn, New York. If anybody thinks Black people only had to build their own communities in the South, Weeksville will make them look again. Because right in Brooklyn, New York, there was already a free Black community in the 19th century, a place where Black people bought land, built homes, raised churches, organized their own community, and created an independent life right in the middle of a northern city. Weeksville began in 1838 when James Weeks, a free Black man, bought land in what is now Brooklyn. At that time, New York was not the slave South, but Black freedom in the North still came with walls around it. Before 1870, Black men in New York had to meet a property requirement in order to vote, while white men were not held to that same burden. So, owning land in Weeksville meant more than having a roof over your head. It was tied to political power, to being counted, to having your name and your voice matter in society. What makes Weeksville so important is that it reminds us the North was not as free as people like to believe. Even in New York, Black people still had to buy their own land, build their own schools, raise their own churches, and create their own community, just to protect their place in the city. White people were not banned from entering Weeksville, but this place proved that Black people did not have to wait for the city to recognize them. They created a part of New York that belonged to them. Today, Weeksville is remembered through the historic Hunterfly roadhouses and the work being done to preserve them. But what remains is more than a few old walls. It is proof that right in the middle of New York, Black people once had to build a place of their own. Number 7. Mound Bayou, Mississippi. In 1887, right in the Mississippi Delta, Isaiah T. Montgomery and Benjamin Green founded Mound Bayou. Both of them had been born into slavery. Think about that for a moment. Men who came up in a system that treated Black people as property went on to build a town where Black people could own land, raise homes, open schools, build churches, run businesses, and govern themselves. What makes Mound Bayou so powerful is where it stood. Mississippi, one of the hardest places in the South for Black people to live with dignity. This was a land where so many Black families had been trapped in farm labor, debt, fear, and the control of white landowners. So when a self-governing Black town rose in the middle of the Delta, it said something without having to shout. Black people could still plant roots, build homes, raise children, and run their own lives in the very place that tried to keep them dependent. Later, Mound Bayou would be called the Jewel of the Delta. That name carried pride. It was the image of a Black community organizing itself in a world that kept trying to make Black life feel small. In Mississippi, where history had placed so much weight on Black people's backs, this town still stood through land, schools, churches, work, and community memory. And when a place like that once existed in the heart of the Delta, it makes us ask, how many other Black jewels have been left under the dust of history for far too long? Number 8. Greenwood District, Tulsa, Oklahoma. Greenwood District in Tulsa is the most famous name on this list, and probably the one that hits the hardest. Before 1921, this place was known as Black Wall Street, a thriving Black economic district with banks, hotels, theaters, restaurants, and hundreds of businesses built by Black people. In an America that kept shutting doors in Black people's faces, Greenwood shined with money, property, jobs, and the belief that this community could stand on its own. Then, from the night of May 31st into June 1st, 1921, everything changed. After Dick Rowland, a young black man was accused of an incident involving Sarah Page, a white woman, rumors spread across Tulsa fast. A white mob came in and Greenwood was attacked, looted, and burned. More than 35 city blocks were destroyed. More than 1,200 homes were turned to ash. Thousands of black residents lost the place they called home. What makes Greenwood such a deep wound is not only what was burned, but when it was burned. This was a black community that owned homes, ran businesses, built wealth, held skilled jobs, and had an economy strong enough to support itself. Number 9. Idlewild, Michigan. There is a hard truth here. During segregation, even black people's right to take a vacation was controlled. They could work, pay taxes, serve the country, and still, when they tried to walk into white hotels, beaches, restaurants, or resorts, the door could be slammed shut in their face. Out of that humiliation, Idlewild, Michigan became one of the most famous black resort communities in America. Starting in the early 20th century, Idlewild was more than a place to escape the summer heat. It was where black people bought land, built vacation homes, opened businesses, put on shows, gathered with family, and felt something rare: the freedom to enjoy themselves without having to brace for somebody telling them to leave. Records show that around 6,000 people bought more than 17,000 lots in Idlewild, and during its golden years, some summer weekends could draw tens of thousands of visitors. And if a people had to build an entire vacation paradise just to breathe easy for a few days, then how much of ordinary life had America already taken from them? Number 10. Rosewood, Florida. In the early 20th century, Rosewood, Florida was a black community with homes, churches, schools, land, and families trying to build a normal life for their children. And back then, for black people, normal already meant something big: a home to come back to, a piece of land to hold on to, a community where they did not have to live like guests in their own homeland. Then, in January 1923, after an accusation involving a white woman in a nearby area, Rosewood was pulled into racial violence. Black families had to run from the place they once called home. Houses were destroyed. Land was left behind. A living community was suddenly pushed into silence, and for decades, America almost let the name Rosewood sink away, as if real people, real families, and real memories had never been there. Rosewood closes this list as a painful reminder that black people did not only lose houses in violence like this. They lost land that should have been passed down, homes that should have stayed lit for generations, and futures that were already being built. And when we speak the name Rosewood again, the point is not to reopen pain for shock. It is to give that place back what was taken from it for far too long: its name, its memory, and the truth. These places remind us of one clear truth: black people did more than survive oppression. They built towns, built communities, and gave those places a soul of their own. They were not just names frozen in pain. They were fathers, mothers, builders, neighbors, and dreamers, trying to hold on to a future for their children. If this story made you think, leave a comment, share it, and keep walking with Hidden Black Chronicles as we bring buried memories back into the light.